does not really qualify at all as a scientific theory because it is more like a Weltanschauung, an ideology of how human beings should be and should behave. Now that is legitimate, but it's not science. It's an ideology is perhaps the best modern word for this. It's a secular religion. Now the therapy, again, unless one believes that there is an illness which is being treated, is not a therapy, but is a way of helping people. And the two actually are really quite separate. It is quite possible to accept a great deal, I think, of the therapeutic ideas and methods and reject virtually all of the theory, which is my position.
The body of scientific evidence to support Freudian theory is so far small and inconclusive. At the Yale Child Study Center in New Haven, researchers are exploring aspects of Freudian theory by observing young children. The study focuses on 4 to 6-year-olds, the age Freud called the most critical phase of development, the Oedipal stage. These researchers acknowledge the importance of many factors in the growth of the child, but like Freud, they see sexual conflict as a key factor, conflict having to do with children's sexual identity and feelings toward their parents. The sessions are videotaped to be studied later.
He has little pants. It's actually a girl with a short haircut.
Oh.
Can you put this down? Can you put that on, please?
Mm-hmm.
It's a dress with pants.
Uh-huh.
Have you ever seen that?
Have you?
Yes.
The research team studies the tapes, looking for the language patterns, the interactions the child has with her analyst, and themes in her play. They believe these act as clues to understanding a child's inner feelings, especially relating to sexual identity.
She's working out. Is it a boy? Is it a girl? And she says at first that it's a boy. She then takes the pants down and says, no, it's a girl. And she's able to deal with the incongruity by saying, well, it's a girl with short hair and pants. And I think that, you know, the curiosity and perhaps some of the conflict that one sees in children at this age is something that she's working on at this moment in the play.
She's playing doctor.
The methods of this study depend on observation and interpretation by the researchers, most of whom are analysts.
Two of them can do together.
The study may be useful in expanding upon Freud's ideas, but it does not meet the rigorous demands of the scientific method.
And we'll go get your mom.
Other researchers are conducting controlled experiments, and the evidence provided by these studies has moved the field of child development beyond Freud. Dr. Jerome Kagan.
Freud was perhaps the boldest theorist we've had in psychology. He believed strongly that the major determinants of the child's normal growth and pathological growth could be fixed to certain experiences in the opening years of life. But he ignored the maturational changes that are occurring in the child's central nervous system that permit new mental or intellectual abilities, and those in turn permit the child to relate him or herself to the parents and to the outside world. And that, it seems to me, was the mistake that he made in the rest of his theorizing by trying to make sexual energy, sexual conflict, sexual anxiety the key, central, primary cause of both normal and pathological development.
Dr. Kagan and his colleagues at Harvard University believe that early experience is important in the development of the individual. But they also believe that the genetic makeup of the child can be a contributor to the development of personality traits. The researchers here use observational methods, along with other experimental techniques, to gather information about a child's predisposition to certain emotions, like boldness, shyness, and in this case, anxiety.
I'm different. Take your time.
These tests are designed to meet the criteria of the experimental method. They have control groups, are repeatable, and provide data from which researchers can predict behavior. Advances in the field of psychology and biology are now beginning to answer some of the same questions posed by Freud almost 100 years ago. In England, a Nobel laureate and one of the scientists who discovered the structure of DNA, Dr. Francis Crick, has turned his attention to the study of the brain, including memory and dreams. How does he assess Freud?
Freud was a very strange case because he started off being interested in the physiology of the brain and wanting to try to relate that physiology to psychology. And he wrote an essay on this, his so-called project. What we know is that the ideas he had about physiology were really wrong. When you look at the ideas, they don't seem very plausible, at least not to me, but they seem to be based on an old-fashioned idea of the mind, and so on, which people interested in information processing, as I do, would regard as rather naive and heavily culturally determined, let's put it that way, which of course was why they had such a great appeal. Mind you, he did have insights. He did make people realize a lot of their behavior, the motives for their behavior wasn't what they thought they were. He did make it clear that people were more influenced by sexual reasons than they, in the 19th century, they were prepared to admit. Maybe it's different nowadays, and so on, and a lot of other things of that sort. But if you ask in strict scientific terms, I'd be very surprised if much of it survives. Freud thought that dreams were wish fulfillment. He thought that was his great idea. But when you read his account and how he had to twist things to fit the theory, it's very difficult to accept this. And I'm not sure that all Freudians now accept that key idea of his. And then, of course, he had other aspects of dreams and so on, which are more complex. And we would feel that's all too fancy, that it's all too easy to interpret dreams without having any check on what the interpretation is. So we're inclined to leave all that on one side and say, that's for the future. We understand so little of the brain at the moment, it's really a waste of time inventing all these things. People love to do it, but in the past they liked to believe that dreams foretold the future. Very few people believe that now, but they like to think there's some deep significance in their dreams. We would think it's just an accidental byproduct produced by somewhat random waves and so on, and you shouldn't read too much into it.
I agree with many of the most prominent natural scientists, biologists, and philosophers of science who have contended that psychoanalysis is not a science, has nothing to do with science. It is an ideology. And it is, of course, significant not for it being a science or for its impact on science, which I think is nil, but as a cultural phenomenon, as a historical phenomenon. It's obvious that psychoanalysis and Freud, and here one really should compare him to someone like Marx or other religious figures, had a tremendous impact on how we live today.
The issue really is one of names here, which I think is not where we should stay. Is it a science or not? The question really is this. Are the assertions made by psychoanalysts, either the global ones, such as the development of a child through various stages, or the more the narrow ones, namely the interpretations that an analyst makes during the hour, are they in any sense reliable? Or are they just ad hoc assertions that you could read about in a novel and agree because they're well stated or disagree because they're not well stated? And I would think that what would have to suggest is that the kind of organized discipline or science that psychoanalysis claims to be, and I think with justice, is one in which proof and disproof are extremely difficult given the nature of the material, but that any other psychology dealing with fundamental human mental realities faces the same problem.
In 1936, Freud celebrated his golden wedding anniversary with his wife, Martha. They were surrounded by friends and a family that now included many grandchildren. But this was one of the last celebrations Freud was to hold near his home in Vienna. In 1938, when the Nazis invaded Austria, he fled to England. In London, Freud was a celebrity. He was honored by the Royal Society. They asked him to sign the official charter book in which his name would appear with the signatures of Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. He was considered for a Nobel Prize several times, but was never chosen. The award he valued most was the Goethe Prize, given not for his scientific contribution, but for his literary achievements. Freud had become the most famous psychologist in the world, but he never achieved the full acceptance of the scientific community. These films are among the last taken of Freud. This was the occasion of his 83rd birthday. He was quite frail, exhausted from a 16-year battle with cancer. He died at his home on September 23rd, 1939. In one of the only recordings of his voice, Freud summarized his life's work.
I started as a neurologist trying to bring relief to my neurotic patients. I discovered some important new facts about the unconscious, the role of instinctual urges, and so on. Out of these findings grew a new science, psychoanalysis, a part of psychology, as a new method of treatment of the neurosis. I had to pay heavily for this bit of good luck. People did not believe in my facts and thought my theories unsavory. Resistance was strong and unrelenting. In the end, I succeeded, but the struggle is not yet over. Sigmund Freud.
For a transcript of this program, send $4 to Nova, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. Please be sure to include the show title. To purchase film or video copies of this program for educational use, call toll-free 1-800-621-2131. In Illinois or Alaska, call Collect, 312-940-1260. This program was produced by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding for Nova is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide. And by